In September 1992, NASA had launched its Mars Observer probe, which packed a suite of sensors to study the red planet, particularly the nature of the surface, the magnetic field, the movement of dust across the seasons, and so on. In August 1993, after nearly a year in space, Observer arrived, began sending back imagery, and then suddenly went dark. Contact was never re-established, and a subsequent investigation concluded that the motor in the probe had suffered a propellant leak which sent it into a spin, which in turn was probably because the motor was designed for use in orbital satellites and wasn't intended to be put in storage for months before launch. At any rate, nobody knows whether the Observer smacked into Mars, went into orbit around it, or shot past and is still going somewhere. After a bit of teeth-sucking, NASA then instituted the Mars Exploration Program later on in October 93, which has had a little more success over the years in landing a number of rovers, including Curiosity, several of which are still operating. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, later nicknamed the Notorious RBG, was sworn into the US Supreme Court to replace Byron Whizzer White, who had been in post since 1962 and been part of the court that introduced Miranda rights and ended segregation under Earl Warren. Ginsburg was a fierce advocate for women's rights and gender equality, a stance partly influenced by her early work in Sweden. She was the second woman nominated to the Supreme Court and joined Sandra Day O'Connor, who'd been nominated by Reagan in 1981 and was still serving. And on the Fox Kids network, the TV show Mighty Morphin Power Rangers debuted on the Saturday of Grand Prix weekend. The series, which would become a pop culture touchstone of the 90s, was based on a Japanese Super Sentai hero franchise. The US producers, Haim Saban and Shuki Levy, took the action footage from a number of different versions of the Japanese show and combined them with a framing story set in the fictional Californian town of Angel Grove. The Power Rangers franchise ran through a number of series, movies and video games until 2011, before briefly being resurrected by Netflix in 2022, and a new series for Disney Plus has just been announced. The IndyCar gang headed to Road America in Wisconsin, where Paul Tracy had a big shunt in qualifying and was getting around on crutches, but still managed to put his Penske on pole, followed by Mansell, Andretti and Boesel. The first yellows came out on lap 4 when rookie Adrian Fernandez had a big off. When they restarted, Tracy simply drove off into the distance and stayed there for the remaining 40-odd laps, taking his second Grand Slam of the year to win by almost 28 seconds from Mansell, with Bobby Rahal third, Boesel fourth and Fittipaldi fifth. On the day of the Belgian Grand Prix, it was back to Canada, this time to Vancouver, and just like in Toronto, Canadian Tracy went into the weekend on the back of a dominant win, but this time it was Scott Goodyear, the other Canadian who shone in practice and took pole, his second of the year, with Rahal alongside, then Mansell and Tracy third and fourth, and Fittipaldi back in 10th. When the race started, Tracy got the jump on Mansell to go third, and the Brit then lost another place to a fast-starting Jeff Gordon. It didn't take long for the first yellows to come out as Olivier Gouillard spun and collected John Unser and Jeff Wood, and Tracy put on another great display from the restart, disposing of Rahal and pressuring Goodyear, finally bullying him out of the way, which allowed Rahal through too. But then his alternator fritzed out, which allowed Goodyear and Rahal, having swapped places again, back through, with Al Unser Jr. now in hot pursuit. He and Rahal also passed Goodyear and went off, scrapping for the lead, until Rahal's pit stop put Unser decisively ahead, lapping Fittipaldi along the way to take his first win in 18 months, ahead of Bobby Rahal and Stefan Johansson, with Mansell back in 6th and Fittipaldi 7th. With 3 rounds to go, Mansell was still on top in the title race and could clinch it in mid-Ohio next time out. That race was on the same date as the Italian Grand Prix, where Prost could sew up the F1 title if things went his way in Belgium and there. It was possible that both titles could change hands on the same day. Over in Europe, after a bit more posturing, Elf's fuel was duly homologated, and Renault reiterated that as far as they were concerned, Williams-Renault was a single entity with Ligier as a favoured customer. They were not interested in supplying a third or fourth team. We're not a charity, they said, and besides, we won't be on top forever. Ford, Ferrari, any of them could beat us next year. While all seemed to have been settled between teams and organisers, the regulation changes for next year hadn't actually been announced publicly yet, while the last few details were nailed down, so speculation remained rife, one of the most popular of which was that refuelling would be introduced for 1994 as a way of trying to shake things up. The silly season in terms of driver musical chairs was also in full swing, as Riccardo Patrese was said to be in negotiations with Peter Sauber to replace the disappointing Leto, Portuguese F3000 star Pedro Lamy was said to be joining Lotus to replace Zenardi, who the team were also apparently disappointed with. Jackie Stewart's son Paul, himself both a driver and team owner in F3000, might follow in his father's footsteps to Tyrrell. Jean-Marc Gounon, with his French state backing and stillborn March drive, was said to be talking to Giancarlo Minardi about a drive, while the similarly cash-strapped Larousse team were linked with pretty much everyone with a French passport. The Scuderia Italia team were almost certain to disappear as an independent team at the end of the year, whether they merged with Minardi or just went bust, with Jean Todt saying Ferrari would not be supplying their V12 engines to anyone else. Over at Tyrrell, designer Mike Coughlin had resigned following the failure of the 021 to improve the team's fortunes. His predecessor Harvey Postlethwaite, currently at Ferrari, still had a stake in the team and might return. With all that going on, the fans descended on Spa-Francorchamps. As well as the local fans, it was always a popular race with the Brits because it usually took place on an August bank holiday weekend, and with the Germans, and especially this year after Michael Schumacher's 1991 debut and 1992 maiden win. It wasn't quite the Schumania like at Hockenheim, but there was a fair bit of Schwarzrot Gold in the stands, as well as a late flurry of bookings from across the channel after Damon Hill's win in Hungary. It was at Spa, too, in 1983 that Thierry Boutsen had made his F1 debut at the wheel of an Arrows, and 10 years on it was here that he announced he was hanging up his helmet, at least as far as F1 was concerned. At 36, and able to look back on 163 starts from 164 entries, Monaco in 1984 being the odd one out, 15 podiums, 1 pole, 1 fastest lap and 3 race wins, he felt that he'd achieved all he was going to in Formula 1 and was really struggling with this year's Jordan, which, despite having been altered for him, was still far too small for his lanky frame. He was driving hunched over and was even getting compressed vertebrae, and finally decided it just wasn't worth it anymore. There was a farewell bash for him on the Wednesday before the race with his wife and son, and some of his friends among the drivers, Michele Alboreto, Riccardo Patrese, and Eric Comas, with whom he'd made up. Ayrton Senna, also a genuine personal friend, was devastated that he couldn't make it because he was stuck in Portugal thanks to a plane crash on the day he was due to fly out, but sent his best regards. When Ayrton did arrive, he was deeply glum. Following Hungary, he'd stopped doing any private testing, which wasn't helping his relationship with Ron Dennis any, saying that, "I'm not having much fun this year, I'm having trouble coping with the present, we haven't solved the problems with the MP48, every race that passes complicates things even more, this car can only win in very special conditions." Senna did cheer up a bit when he went round to the Ferrari motorhome to celebrate his friend Gerhard Berger's 34th birthday, smooshing a serving of cream cake onto the Austrian's increasingly thinning hair, but was also seen talking to Jean Todt and saying that of course he'd love to drive for Ferrari and would like the opportunity sometime before he retired, but maybe not next year. Strong rumours said that Prost, having all but secured his 4th title, had relented and would partner Senna at Williams in 1994, with Hill possibly moving to Benetton to partner Schumacher. And if Flavio Briatore did manage to get Renault engine parity as well, that could be a very competitive season indeed. The cars then took to the track on Friday morning, but the practice session was curtailed when, storming out of Eau Rouge at approaching 175 miles an hour, Zenardi's active suspension failed, leading into a terrifying crash as the Lotus slammed into the wall, briefly burst into flames, spun across the track, and what was left of the car came to rest in a gravel trap. Michael Andretti, first on the scene, braked to avoid the debris, which took Senna behind by surprise, and he spun off rather more gently before both hopped out to see if they could help. The unlucky Italian was carefully extracted from his car in a neck brace and sent off to hospital in Liège. A battery of tests showed that he'd only broken his nose and tooth when he hit his head on the steering wheel, and he seemed in good spirits when talking to journalists at the hospital, but he would certainly be taking no further part in the weekend. Senna, meanwhile, was given a reprimand for not slowing down enough under yellow flags, which is a bit harsh as Radion's a blind summit and he'd been blindsided by Andretti. With the debris cleared up, Friday qualifying saw Hill on provisional pole as Prost got his tyre pressures wrong, but everyone went faster on Saturday and Hill just couldn't live with Prost, lining up in second place just under 9/10 behind. Schumacher was third, but a second and a half adrift of Prost, while Alesi was delighted to drag his oversteering Ferrari into fourth. Senna, still in a bad mood after his reprimand and everything else, exuded can't-be-bothered energy and still managed fifth, while Suzuki qualified a joint career-best 6th place in the footwork alongside Derek Warwick in 7th. The footwork with its McLaren active suspension was just getting better and better and was in danger of overhauling Ron Dennis's cars. Patrese was 8th, just ahead of Leto, who, perhaps looking over his shoulder, had dug deep to put his Sauber in 9th, and Johnny Herbert bravely not only got back in his Lotus, still not knowing what had actually broken on Zanardi's car, but went flat out to put it in 10th, though he was over 3.5 seconds off Prost's time. Michael Andretti seemed almost as gloomy as Senna and was back in 14th, while birthday boy Berger could only manage 16th after a series of breakdowns. The Jordans suffered from understeer, with Barrichello 13th and Boutsen down in 20th for his swan song after just not finding the right settings. The Tyrrells, on the other hand, suited the track for once, and De Cesaris took advantage to start 17th, just in front of Alio, who'd also crashed hard on Friday in the same place as Zenardi, but had walked away. The Minardis and Lolas were at the back again, both understeering like mad in the slow corners. Undrivable was Alboretto's simple verdict. Sunday dawned gloriously sunny, but the pre-race drivers' briefing was tatchy as Senna demanded a widening of the gravel trap at the top of Radial and felt Roland Brunscherider was overly dismissive in pointing out that it couldn't be done that morning, fumed out and refused to take part in the vintage car driver parade. It wasn't looking like a great day for Ferrari either, as Alesi felt something go in his suspension as he climbed out of Eau Rouge in the warm-up. Fortunately for him, he was able to keep it on the track and get back to the pits, where the team found a broken push rod and suspected a manufacturing defect. A call with John Barnard back home in England later, the team were adding reinforcements to the push rods, but with Zanardi's accident fresh in their memory, Alesi was a bit nervous about going out again in it. Jean Todt left it up to him and ultimately he decided to go. Berger, for his part, ended up having to take the T-car and start from the pits, as they were still frantically adding the reinforcements when the grid assembled. The red lights went green, and away they went, but something went wrong with the Benetton's new launch software, and both Schumacher and Patrese were very slow away, forcing everyone else to weave between them, as Prost got a good start for once, as did Alesi, who nearly nabbed second before having to throw out the anchors, and Senna came charging through, taking second off Hill as well. So Prost led Senna, Hill, Alesi, then the two footworks of Suzuki and Warwick, then Leto and Herbert, Schumacher down in 9th and Brundle 10th, with Patrese who'd slipped back to 17th and Berger making his way forward from the back. Boutsen's grand farewell lasted all of 500 metres before his gearbox broke, and he pulled resignedly off at Les Combes, while Prost was already pulling away from Senna, who had Hill right on his gearbox. They went round to start lap 2 and Damon got in Ayrton's tow coming through Eau Rouge and Radial, then took second on the Kemmel Straight and headed off into the middle distance, while Schumacher was putting on a charge of his own, taking Herbert, Leto and Warwick all on lap 2 and setting about Suzuki, taking 5th along Kemmel and then heading off in pursuit of Alesi. Further back, Patrese was similarly motoring, taking 3 places to be up to 14th by lap 3. Alesi would usually be a much tougher nut to crack, but he could feel his Ferrari bottoming out through Radial and didn't fight for the place, instead coming round to head into the pits before something broke on his suspension. Derek Warwick had had a couple of bad laps and seen both Leto and Herbert go past, so by lap 5 the order was Prost, Hill, Senna, Schumacher, Suzuki and Leto in the points, with Herbert, Warwick, Brundle and Wendlinger making up the top 10, with Patrese now up to 11th and Andretti 12th. Schumacher caught up to Senna, and it was another Ford V8 off, while further back Herbert was attacking Leto for 6th, these latter two and Suzuki all averaging 4 seconds a lap slower than the top 4. Unseen, Herbert took 6th off Leto, whose teammate Wendlinger had had to come in to have a new windshield put on, the turbulence from his broken one having been buffeting his head around. Senna seemed to be holding Schumacher up, but the German just couldn't find a way to get past, and was very aware that both Williamses were pulling away, while Prost was in turn leaving Hill behind, now to the tune of about 6 seconds by lap 10. A 3-car train of Leto, Warwick and Patrese in 7th through 9th places had developed, as Ricciardo moved ahead of Derek on lap 12, and Barrichello trailed in to retire with a broken wheel bearing, ending Jordan's race. It was just approaching 1/3 distance, and with most teams going for a 2-stop strategy, it was pit stop time and first in was Hill, despite Prost's tyres now being very worn. A flash of yellow and green as he sat there was Schumacher also coming in to see if he could get the advantage of Senna with an earlier stop. And Prost was next in, a slightly quicker stop than Damon's, and then Senna too, the Brazilian emerging right in front of Senna, who was forced to put a wheel on the grass to get past, but get past he did. You'll have to take my word on that because the TV director decided not to show it. All of that had put Prost out still 6 seconds ahead of Hill, then another 7 seconds back to Schumacher, who led Senna by 4. Patrese was still harrying Leto, who peeled in for new tyres on lap 15 alongside Suzuki and Brundle. Andretti was in the next time round only to stall his engine and need it restarting, but Suzuki's fine race was run, his gearbox hydraulics leaking fluid and seizing the whole thing up. The two Minardis had almost simultaneous accidents, Martini fluffing a gear change and going flying off at Stavolo, while Fittipaldi's suspension broke crossing the start-finish line and he wiped a wheel off on the barriers and bounced across to come to rest on the verge, leaving a brave Marshall to go get the wheel. Patrese made his tyre stop late, which put a charging Berger up into 6th, but Ricciardo was a little too ambitious putting his foot down on the cold tyres and spun gracefully at the pit lane exit, letting Leto and Brundle past, as well as Wendlinger unlapping himself after his lengthy stop. So Berger in 6th now had a little queue behind him of both Saubers, on different laps, Brundle, Patrese and Warwick. The Austrian's elbow was still giving him jip, especially when he bounced across the curbs at the bus stop, so he was doing pretty well considering he'd started last. Patrese, keen to atone for his rookie error, was all over the back of Brundle like a sweaty t-shirt, with Warwick hot on his heels to boot. Patrese took 8th going down Kemmel on lap 20, while away in the lead, Prost was finding something up in his active suspension hydraulics, which had started to form bubbles, and Hill was able to start closing in a bit, breaking the lap record and getting the gap down to just under 2 seconds as half distance approached. Schumacher was also on a charge, lapping within a tenth or two of Hill, and now just 7 seconds behind him. Berger gave up the unequal struggle on his tyres and came in for new ones on lap 21, returning to the track 12th after a slow stop, as a charging Patrese blasted past Leto for 6th, as both of them lapped Alboreto. Schumacher was likewise charging, setting a new lap record in his pursuit of the Williamses. When Prost was held up lapping Andretti, Hill closed right up, and as they all braked for Les Combes on lap 24, both Williamses pulled out, Hill looking to get inside Prost, but Alain slammed the door, then put his foot down a bit and started opening out a lead again. By lap 27 the gap was back up to 3 seconds, while Schumacher had been held up failing to lap Berger and had dropped back too, and De Cesaris dropped out entirely with a blown Yamaha and didn't seem entirely impressed with the enthusiastic firefighting. Having flat-spotted his tyres lapping Berger at last, Senna made his second stop on lap 28, getting out just ahead of Senna, still ploughing a lonely furrow in 4th, and then 2 laps later Hill followed Katayama down the pit lane to do his own second stop, 6.5 seconds, and he raced for the pit exit as Schumacher emerged onto the main straight, only for the TV director to instead jump cut between Prost, Patrese and an empty track. The cameras followed Prost round the track until he pitted himself, but a 9-second stop delayed by a front left wheel nut dropped him behind... who? It was Hill, the cameras picking him up as he blasted through Eau Rouge in the lead, with Prost and then Schumacher close behind, all bearing down on 7th place Brundle. Prost's gearbox was now playing up, missing a gear and letting Schumacher close right up. Then, under braking for Les Combes on lap 32, the German got on the brakes very late indeed to take second in a cloud of tyre smoke. Hill was 4.4 seconds in the lead by this point, but Schumacher had the scent of another Spa win in his nostrils and had his foot firmly to the floor, getting the gap down to 2 seconds by lap 38, as Prost, his car not 100% and miles ahead of Senna, seemed to have settled for 4 points and 1 more than Senna as he inched towards his title. Schumacher continued pushing, and Hill responded, and the pair were trading lap records. By lap 40, with 5 to go, Hill had got the gap back to 4 seconds when Schumacher was held up by traffic, and Prost put in the fastest lap of the race next time around to prove he was still there. Clear of the back markers, Schumacher charged again, taking a second out of Hill's lead. Berger had an excursion across the gravel traps at Rivage when his foot got wedged between his pedals, regaining the course but having lost places to Leto and Andretti in the meantime, and now had Blundell bearing down on him, renewing their duel from Germany. Andretti meanwhile had taken 8th off Leto after a little bump with the nose at La Source. With 2 laps to go, Hill had the gap back up to 4 seconds, and Schumacher seemed to accept defeat, and Damon was able to ease round lap 45 and take the checkered flag for his second race win, the 70th for the Williams team and the 50th for Renault. Schumacher was 3.6 seconds behind at the end, with Prost another 11 seconds back in 3rd, Senna 4th, with Herbert and Patrese making up the top 6, then Brundle, Andretti and Leto, while Berger and Blundell had collided off camera and neither would finish. 14 points for Williams and 3 for McLaren saw Williams secure the Constructors' title, while Benetton took second off McLaren to boot. After Zenardi's accident, Herbert had done well to score points for Lotus, bringing them back to within 2 points of Ferrari, as rumours suggested that they would be getting the powerful Mugen Honda engines for 1994. Prost seemed in good humour afterwards, teasing Schumacher that he'd never win if he copied his starts, and congratulating Damon on having the honour of having the 50th win for Renault, the occasion of a big party on Wednesday at Viry-Châtillon, and on having beaten everyone else fair and square. So, with Prost leading Senna in the standings by 28 points with 4 more races to go, a win for the Frenchman at Monza in 2 weeks' time would secure him the 4th title that looked a nailed-on certainty at this point.